They fired me without a backup, then paid me to save themselves. I never thought I'd share this, but the day HR called me into conference room C with the glass walls and the broken thermostat, I already knew something was wrong because nobody ever asked you to bring your badge and laptop unless they were about to pretend it was just business. I remember smoothing my skirt, noticing the faint hum of the projector, thinking about how I'd skipped lunch to finish a deck that morning, and wondering if I'd finally burned out enough for it to show on my face. The HR director smiled the way people do when they're about to ruin your week, hands folded, voice soft, telling me they'd received concerns about my commitment and alignment, and I felt that strange floaty calm settle in, the kind you get right before a car accident. They said restructuring, performance optics, leadership confidence, all those words that mean nothing and everything, while my manager stared at the table like it might open and swallow him whole. I'd given that company 6 years, climbed from junior analyst to unofficial fixer of everything broken and invisible. The woman people messaged at 9:47 p.m. with quick question that turned into 3 hours of unpaid crisis control. HR slid the envelope toward me, already sealed, already decided, and said today would be my last day. No warning, no improvement plan, just a practice speech and a request for my badge. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room realized, was that the calm wasn't resignation. It was relief mixed with something sharper, because as I listened to them talk about continuity and knowledge transfer, I understood how little they actually knew about what I did, how much of the company's daily survival lived only in my head, in half-finished notebooks, in processes I'd been told we'd formalize later. As I stood up, badge warm in my hand, I thought about every late night, every time I'd swallowed my frustration to be professional, every time I'd been told to be grateful. Walking back to my desk under escort, coworkers pretending not to look, I felt a quiet click inside me, like a door locking. They thought this story ended with me packing a box. They had no idea it was just beginning. By the time I got home that night, my box of desk leftovers cutting into my arms, the adrenaline had worn off and left behind that hollow ache you only feel when something central gets ripped away without your consent. I set the box down in my kitchen and just stood there, staring at my apartment like I was seeing it for the first time, realizing how much of my identity had been outsourced to a company that had erased me in under 15 minutes. I poured a glass of cheap wine even though it was only Tuesday, and sat on the floor with my back against the couch, replaying the meeting in my head, the HR script, my manager's silence, the way nobody asked what I was actually working on when they cut me loose. That's when my phone started buzzing, Slack notifications rolling in because apparently no one had remembered to revoke my access yet, and I watched message after message pop up from people asking where files were, how to run reports, why something wasn't syncing like it usually did. I didn't answer, not out of spite, not yet, but because for the first time in years, I wasn't obligated to. As the evening went on, the messages grew more frantic, my former team looping each other in, tagging my name with little digital lifelines, and I felt this strange mix of guilt and validation because part of me had begged leadership for months to let me document and delegate these processes, to build redundancy so everything didn't hinge on one exhausted woman. They'd told me it wasn't a priority. I scrolled through my personal email and saw the calendar invites I'd been copied on out of habit, meetings that would fall apart without me there to quietly steer them back on course, and I realized something that made me laugh out loud, a sharp, almost hysterical sound in my empty apartment. They hadn't fired me because I was replaceable. They'd fired me because they thought I was. Around midnight, my manager finally texted my personal number, not even pretending it was about my well-being, just a casual, "Hey, quick question. Do you remember how you set up the quarterly reconciliation macro?" I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen, feeling the weight of every unpaid hour I donated to making him look competent. Then I set my phone face down and went to bed, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after being discarded is nothing at all. The next morning, I woke up at 6:12 like I always did, not because I had anywhere to be, but because my body had been trained by years of calendar alerts and low-grade panic. And for a few seconds, I lay there waiting for the familiar dread to climb up my throat. When it didn't, I almost didn't know what to do with myself. I made coffee, opened my laptop out of habit, and that's when I saw the auto-forwarding rule I'd set up months earlier. Anything from our executive escalations inbox still hit my personal archive because I'd been tired of missing fires when I was off PTO. I should have deleted it the second HR slid that envelope at me, but I hadn't even thought about it. There, glowing on my screen like a warning flare, was an email thread titled Urgent Invoice Sync Failure, Client Threatening Hold. The client name made my stomach drop. Argyle Health Systems? The one account that kept our quarter from looking like a joke. The one my manager bragged about stabilizing, even though I'd built the entire workaround that made their data feed behave. I clicked, telling myself I was just curious, like rubbernecking at an accident. But the deeper I read, the more I realized this wasn't a small hiccup. The overnight sync had failed, the automated reconciliation didn't run, and now their finance team was seeing mismatched totals that made it look like we double billed them. My old teammates were scrambling in the thread, tossing out guesses, tagging leadership, asking if anyone knew where the guide lived. And someone I'd trained, someone I'd covered for, actually wrote, "Didn't she have a cheat sheet?" Like I was a human post-it note they'd misplaced. Then the CFO replied with one sentence that made my hands go cold. "Get this fixed before 10 a.m. or we lose our guile." I stared at my coffee mug, the one that still had the company logo on it because I'd been too tired to care, and I thought about all the times I'd stayed late to prevent exactly this scenario, not for praise, but because I couldn't stand the idea of innocent people getting caught in corporate incompetence. I could fix it in 15 minutes, honestly, maybe 10. It wasn't magic. It was just knowledge, the kind you only get when you're the one quietly stitching a system together while everyone else slides into meetings to talk about strategy. My phone buzzed again, and when I finally flipped it over, I saw a new text from HR. "Please confirm you returned all company materials." That's when it hit me, clean and bright as a match strike. They still thought they were in control of this narrative, and I was the one who had to decide what the next chapter looked like. I wish I could say I took the high road instantly, that I deleted the forwarding rule, closed my laptop, and went on a healing walk like the kind of person who has matching athleisure and inner peace. But the truth is, I sat there in my pajamas, coffee cooling, staring at that Argyle thread until my jaw ached from clenching. There's a special kind of rage that comes from watching the people who dismissed you suddenly flail in the exact chaos you warned them about, and it's not even satisfying at first. It's just loud inside your body. I opened a blank note and wrote 2 columns like I was negotiating with myself. Help them and don't. Under help them, I wrote, Argyle is real people. Finance teams, hospital budgets, downstream mess. Under don't, I wrote, they fired you, they humiliated you, they never listened. They'll take credit again, they will never learn unless it hurts. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from my former coworker, Tessa. Hey, I know you're probably upset, but can you please tell me where the sync key is stored? I'm getting yelled at. I stared at that message and felt my anger shift. Not at Tessa exactly, but at the structure that always made women like us carry the emotional labor of corporate disasters. I typed back, then deleted it, then typed again. I'm not employed there. That was it. No apology, no emoji, no softening. My hands shook a little when I hit send, like I'd just done something dangerous, and in a way I had, because I'd broken the unspoken rule that says you have to remain useful even after you're discarded. 10 minutes later, my manager called. I watched it ring. He called again. Then he left a voicemail that started with a forced chuckle and ended with panic. Hey, so, we've got a situation, but it's totally minor. Just need you to hop on for like 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Like my life was an app he could reopen whenever he felt like it. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened my laptop and drafted an email to HR, short and icy, confirming I'd returned my badge and laptop and that any further requests should be directed to my personal email in writing. I didn't mention Argyle. I didn't mention the forwarding rule. I just watched the thread update in real time as executives piled in, tossing blame around like hot coals, and then I saw the line that made my stomach flip. We may need to bring her back as a contractor. There it was, finally said out loud. They were going to ask me to save them, and for the first time, I wasn't going to do it for free. By noon, my former manager had escalated from 5 minutes to, can you just help us understand what you built? Which is corporate for we're drowning, and we need the person we pretended didn't matter. And I had to keep reminding myself that none of this was my emergency anymore. Still, the guilt sat in my chest like a stone, because I knew how these things worked. Leadership would pressure the nearest working-level people, my old team would stay late, someone would miss dinner with their kids, and then executives would pat themselves on the back for navigating a challenge. Around 1:30 p.m., an unknown number called, and the caller ID said HR, which honestly made me snort, because I'd never had HR call me directly when I was begging for a title adjustment, or even just a comp review. I answered anyway, voice calm, and the HR director launched into a syrupy tone like we were old friends. She said they appreciated my contributions and wanted to discuss a short-term consulting arrangement to support transition. Transition, as if my job had gracefully ended, not been yanked out from under me. I asked what the scope was, what the hourly rate would be, and there was a pause so long I could picture her blinking at her script. She offered a number that was basically my salary broken into an hourly rate, like I was supposed to be grateful for arithmetic. I told her, politely, that I didn't do emergency consulting at a discount, and if they wanted me to touch anything related to Argyle, it would be at a premium rate, in writing, with a minimum block of hours paid up front. The silence on the other end turned hard. She tried to pivot into loyalty language, how I'd care about the team, and I felt my stomach twist because that tactic had worked on me for years. I took a breath and said, "You terminated me yesterday. You don't get loyalty as a service." She asked what I considered reasonable, and I named a number that made my hands tingle as I said it, because it was big, because it was what my expertise was actually worth, because it was what they'd saved for years by keeping me underleveled. She sputtered, called it unrealistic, said they'd have to get approval, and I told her to take her time, then hung up before she could reframe me as difficult. 2 hours later, my phone lit up with an email from legal titled Independent Contractor Agreement, Urgent, and I realized the panic had finally climbed high enough to reach the people who only speak when there's liability. I opened the attachment, scanned the clauses, and there it was in black and white. They wanted my brain back, but only if they could still control the story. I stared at the screen, felt that internal door click again, and started editing. I spent the afternoon hunched over my laptop like I was back at work, except this time every word I typed was for me, not for people who'd proven they didn't deserve my flexibility. I rewrote their contractor agreement line by line, stripping out vague language about knowledge transfer, adding clear boundaries about scope, response times, and ownership, and when I finished, I attached my own rate sheet like a quiet act of rebellion. It felt surreal, negotiating against a company that had treated me like a line item, but also empowering in a way I hadn't expected, like reclaiming something I didn't realize I'd lost. At 4:18 p.m., legal replied with a clipped acknowledgement and a promise to review internally, which I knew meant a room full of executives arguing about whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. Around the same time, my Slack access finally died, the app refreshing into a polite error message, and with it went the real-time chaos I'd been watching all day. Instead, the updates came through my forwarding rule, now slower, heavier, emails titled things like client escalation and board visibility, words designed to trigger panic. Argyle was threatening to pause payments. The CFO wanted hourly updates. Someone suggested rolling back the system, which would have made things worse. And I could almost hear myself from the past explaining why, voice hoarse, being politely ignored. I took a break and went for a walk, something I hadn't done on a weekday in years, and the sun felt too bright, the air too sharp, like my senses were rebooting. When I got back, there was a new email waiting, this one from my manager's boss, the kind who never knew my name but always knew my metrics. "Let's reset," he wrote, as if that was a thing you could just do without accountability. "We're prepared to move forward under your terms." Attached was the revised agreement, signed. I read it twice, then a third time, heart thudding, because saying yes meant stepping back into the mess, but on my terms, with the truth finally acknowledged in dollars and signatures. I replied with a simple confirmation and an invoice for the upfront payment, due immediately, and only after the payment hit my account did I open my calendar and schedule a 1-hour block for the next morning. 1 hour. That's all it would take to fix what they'd broken, and I couldn't decide if that made me proud of my competence or furious at how preventable it all had been. The next morning, I logged in exactly at the time I'd specified, not a minute early, hair still damp from the shower, coffee actually enjoyed instead of inhaled, and I joined the emergency Zoom to a grid of exhausted faces that all froze for half a second when they saw me. No one said sorry. No one acknowledged the way this meeting existed, only because they'd decided my role was expendable. They just launched into the problem like I was a tool they'd finally found in the back of a drawer. I listened quietly as they described symptoms I already understood, nodding, asking a few clarifying questions I didn't actually need answered, and then I shared my screen and walked them through the fix step by step, slow on purpose, not to punish them, but to make sure they saw how many moving parts were involved, how many decisions had been made over time, how much lived outside a neat diagram. When I executed the final command and the reconciliation kicked off cleanly, numbers snapping back into alignment, there was an audible exhale across the call, relief so thick it almost felt like gratitude. The CFO thanked me. My manager said, "We really couldn't have done this without you." Like, that was a new discovery and not something I'd been saying for years. I wrapped it up at exactly the 1-hour mark and said I'd send a brief summary and recommendations for preventing this in the future, which I did, carefully worded, meticulously documented, and explicitly labeled as outside the scope of my current contract. When I signed off, my inbox immediately filled with follow-ups, questions, soft attempts to keep me engaged just a little longer, and I ignored them all because my time was no longer an open tab. That afternoon, payment cleared for the next block of hours without me prompting them, and that's when it really sank in that they finally understood leverage. Just too late to pretend it had been mutual respect. What surprised me wasn't how good it felt to be proven right, but how little I wanted to go back, even with the power shifted. I looked around my apartment, at the quiet, at the space in my brain where constant low-level panic used to live, and I realized this whole ordeal had cracked something open I couldn't unsee. Fixing their mess had confirmed my value, sure, but it had also shown me how small they'd kept my world. And once you see that clearly, there's no patch that can restore things to the way they were. 2 days into contracting, the company started acting like this was normal, like I'd always been some external resource they could summon with a purchase order, and that shift in their tone told me everything about how they plan to spin the story internally. My manager sent a chirpy email to the whole department about bringing in specialized support during a transition period, carefully avoiding the words fired or mistake, and I watched the narrative get rewritten in real time to protect the people who'd made the call. Meanwhile, I was getting pinged by random directors I'd barely spoken to before, asking for quick consults, each request framed like it was tiny, each one quietly trying to rope me back into being the invisible glue. I stuck to the contract like it was scripture, responding with polite reminders about scope and invoicing, and you could feel the frustration in their replies, because they weren't used to me having boundaries. The real twist came on Friday afternoon when I got an email from a recruiter with a subject line so blunt it almost made me laugh. Confidential. Your name came up. Again. I almost deleted it out of reflex, but something made me open it, and inside was a message from a VP at a competitor I'd heard of but never seriously considered. She wrote like a human, not like HR, saying she'd followed my work from industry circles, that she'd heard about recent changes at my company, and that if I was open to talking, she'd make time whenever. It hit me like a slap that my industry had been watching me quietly, while my own leadership treated me like a cost to minimize. I scheduled the call. We talked for 20 minutes, and she asked questions that made my brain light up. Real questions about architecture and strategy, not just status updates and optics. She didn't ask why I was available. She asked what I wanted next. When she mentioned the salary band and the team's size, an actual team, not just me and a rotating cast of burnt-out juniors, I felt my throat tighten because I'd gotten so used to begging for basic support that the idea of being resourced felt almost suspicious. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the wall, thinking about how quickly my old company had been willing to erase me, and how quickly someone else was willing to invest. That night, another emergency email came in from my former CFO asking if I could hop on over the weekend, and I realized I'd reached the point where the corporate guilt button they'd installed in me wasn't working anymore. I replied with one sentence. Happy to schedule time next week per contract. Then I opened a new document on my laptop and titled it, simply, Exit Plan. Writing that exit plan felt surreal, like drafting blueprints for a life I hadn't let myself imagine while I was busy surviving. And the more I wrote, the more obvious it became how narrow my world had been inside that company. Step 1 was obvious. Finish the contracted work cleanly, no bridges burned, no messy emotions in writing, just professionalism so sharp it couldn't be questioned. Step 2 was harder, except that I didn't owe them anything beyond what was signed. Not explanations, not emotional labor, not reassurance that they were still good people. Over the next week, I watched the pattern repeat itself again and again, leadership creating urgency out of poor planning, then trying to funnel that urgency into me as if I were still on payroll. Each time, I redirected them to the contract, attached an invoice, and waited. And each time the money showed up faster than the last, because now the panic was trained. Meanwhile, the recruiter calls multiplied, quiet at first, then bolder, people I'd crossed paths with years ago suddenly circling back, and I realized my reputation had been traveling without me, built on results I'd never been allowed to publicly own. One afternoon, while I was on yet another paid call explaining the same system I'd begged them to document, my former manager slipped and said, "We really should have fought harder to keep you." And I felt this strange tenderness mixed with annoyance, because maybe he meant it, but meaning it now didn't undo what had already been decided for me. That night, I got an offer. Not a vague promise, not a "let's see," but a real offer, with numbers that made me sit down, benefits that acknowledged I was a human being, and a role that wasn't defined by how much I could absorb before breaking. I didn't accept it immediately. I let myself sleep on it, which felt like the ultimate luxury. The next morning, I emailed my former company to let them know I'd be concluding my consulting work at the end of the agreed period and would not be renewing. The reply came fast, too fast, full of disappointment dressed up as understanding, and an ask, always an ask, for a bit more time. I read it once, then archived it. For the first time since that HR meeting, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. The last week of my consulting contract felt like standing on the shore watching a storm recede, the damage done but the air finally clearing. And every interaction with my former company carried this brittle politeness that cracked if you pressed too hard. They scheduled knowledge capture sessions that were really thinly disguised attempts to squeeze out one more ounce of my brain, and I answered carefully, deliberately, documenting what was reasonable and leaving the rest where it belonged, with the context they'd never valued enough to preserve. My manager tried to reminisce once, saying things like, "Remember when we pulled that all-nighter before the board meeting?" As if shared exhaustion was a fond memory instead of a warning sign we'd both ignored, and I nodded without engaging, because I'd learned that nostalgia is often just another way to avoid accountability. On my final paid call, the CFO asked if I had any parting advice, and I almost laughed, because I'd given them years of advice they'd filtered out as inconvenient. I told him, calmly, that no system should depend on one person, and no person should be made to feel indispensable and invisible at the same time, and the silence that followed told me he'd never heard it put that plainly before. When the contract officially ended, there was no farewell, no announcement, just the quiet absence of emails, like someone turning off a light in a room you've already left. I accepted the new job that afternoon, signing the offer letter with hands that shook less than I'd expected, and as soon as it was done, a wave of exhaustion hit me so hard I had to lie down, because my body was finally catching up to years of deferred stress. That night, I went out to dinner with a friend I hadn't seen in months, and when she asked how work was, I surprised myself by smiling and saying, "I start something new on Monday," instead of launching into a rant. Walking home, city lights blurring in the cold, I realized that what hurt most about being fired wasn't the loss of income or status. It was the way it had trained me to doubt my own worth and how long it had taken to unlearn that. I went to sleep knowing there were still loose ends, still feelings I hadn't sorted, but for the first time, they felt like mine to process, not problems I needed to fix before someone else noticed. Starting the new job felt like stepping into an alternate version of my life, one where meetings had agendas that actually meant something, and people listened when I spoke instead of nodding and moving on. And for the first few days, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. My new boss asked what resources I needed instead of what I could do without, and when I mentioned building redundancy into the systems from day one, she nodded like it was obvious, not inconvenient. Still, the old habits lingered. My reflex to over-prepare, to apologize before asking questions, to check my email late at night just in case, and I caught myself doing it, laughed softly, and closed the laptop. Meanwhile, my former company couldn't quite let go, and even though the contract had ended, I got a message forwarded from a mutual contact saying leadership was struggling with continuity and wondering if I'd reconsider short-term help. I didn't respond, but the message sat with me, stirring up a mix of anger and sadness, because part of me had loved that place once. Loved the idea of what it could have been if they'd made different choices. A week later, a junior analyst I used to mentor reached out on LinkedIn, asking for advice because she was suddenly drowning in work that had fallen to her, and reading her message felt like looking at my younger self through a warped mirror. I told her, gently but honestly, to document everything, to protect her time, and to remember that no company rewards martyrdom the way it promises to. Hitting send on that message felt like closing a loop I didn't know was still open. That night, as I walked home from my new office, badge clipped to my coat like a fresh start instead of a shackle, I realized something quietly profound. Being fired had hurt, deeply, but staying would have hollowed me out. The injustice of it still flared sometimes, especially when I thought about how easily my contributions had been erased, but it was no longer the center of the story. I was building something again, not just systems, but a version of myself that didn't confuse endurance with loyalty, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like real progress. The real reckoning came about a month later, quietly, the way most meaningful things do, when I ran into my former CFO at an industry networking event I'd almost skipped because old instincts told me to avoid uncomfortable rooms. He looked startled when he saw me, then relieved, like he'd been rehearsing this moment in his head, and after some stiff small talk, he finally admitted the truth I'd already guessed. They were still dealing with fallout. Not catastrophic, not headline-worthy, but constant friction, small failures compounding because no one fully understood the ecosystem I'd built under pressure and neglect. He said my name had come up in a board meeting as a lesson, not an apology, but a cautionary tale about key person risk. And hearing that phrase applied to my life made me feel oddly distant, like they were discussing a structural flaw instead of a human being. I listened politely, nodded, and when he asked if I'd consider advising them long-term, I surprised myself by feeling nothing. No temptation, no vindication, just clarity. I told him I was happy where I was and wished them luck. And the look on his face was something like grief mixed with embarrassment, because he finally understood that what they'd lost wasn't just expertise, it was trust. Walking away from that conversation felt like closing a door with a gentle click instead of a slam, and I realized that the version of me who would have replayed it for days, wondering if I'd said the right thing, was gone. At my new job, I was building systems with teams that shared the load, documenting as we went, planning for vacations and sick days like they were normal parts of life, not weaknesses. One afternoon, as I was leaving on time, I caught my reflection in the office glass, shoulders relaxed, phone untouched, and I barely recognized myself. The story I'd been telling about my worth, about what I had to endure to deserve a seat at the table, was unraveling thread by thread, and in its place was something steadier, quieter, and infinitely more sustainable. I thought the story would taper off there, fade into a neat moral about boundaries and better jobs, but life rarely wraps itself up that cleanly. And a few weeks later, my former company provided one last unsolicited epilogue. A mutual contact forwarded me an internal memo that was circulating quietly, framed as a process improvement initiative, and reading it felt like déjà vu in corporate font. They'd instituted mandatory documentation reviews, cross-training requirements, backup owners for every critical system, all the things I'd begged for when I was still there, now packaged as a proactive leadership win. My name wasn't mentioned once, not even obliquely, and that omission stung more than outright blame would have, because erasure is easier than accountability. I closed the email and sat with that feeling, letting it exist without trying to fix it, which was new for me, because I'd spent years trying to be palatable, even in my own head. That afternoon, a calendar invite popped up at my new job for a team lunch, celebrating a small but meaningful milestone we'd hit together. And when my boss thanked everyone by name, including me, I felt this quiet warmth that no performance review had ever given me. It wasn't about recognition as currency. It was about being seen as part of a system instead of a pressure valve. On the way home, I thought about how close I'd come to staying, to accepting a counteroffer or a permanent consulting role just to prove something to people who'd already shown me their limits. I realized then that the real revenge wasn't the money or the leverage or even the validation. It was the fact that I no longer needed them to understand what they'd lost in order to move on. That understanding was mine now, internal and unshakable, and it changed the way I carried myself through the world. Lighter, steadier, like I'd finally put something heavy down without waiting for permission. The last thing I didn't expect was how often people would ask me to tell the story, like it was something inspirational instead of something that had cracked me open at the time, and each time I found myself editing it subconsciously to make it sound cleaner, braver, less messy than it actually was. Friends would say things like, "It all worked out," and I'd nod, even though the truth was that for a long time it hadn't felt like it would, that there were nights after I'd been fired where I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering if I'd missed some invisible rule that everyone else seemed to know. What changed wasn't luck or timing, so much as the moment I stopped trying to make myself smaller to fit into systems that thrived on my silence. At my new job, I started mentoring a few junior women, not in a formal program, just coffee chats and honest conversations. And when they asked how to become indispensable, I surprised myself by saying, "Don't." I told them to become valuable, yes, but also visible, documented, and replaceable in the healthiest way, because no one should have to be a single point of failure to feel secure. One of them laughed nervously, like she thought I was exaggerating, and I recognized that look immediately, the one that says you haven't learned this lesson yet, but you're going to. Sometimes I'd get the urge to check my old company's LinkedIn, to see who'd taken over my responsibilities, to measure my absence like a bruise, and when I did, it never gave me what I thought it would. Closure, I learned, doesn't come from watching other people struggle or succeed in your shadow. It comes from building a life where their choices no longer define your nervous system. By the time my 1-year anniversary at the new job rolled around, I realized I hadn't thought about that HR meeting in weeks. And when I finally did, it felt distant, like a story someone else had told me. The woman who walked out with a cardboard box had survived something important, but she wasn't who I was anymore. And that realization felt like the quietest, most complete kind of victory. I never got a dramatic apology, no executive-wide email admitting they'd been wrong, no poetic moment where my former manager showed up at my door with tearful regret. And honestly, I'm glad, because the older version of me would have mistaken that for closure and tried to fold myself back into the same story. Instead, closure arrived on an ordinary Wednesday when I was leaving my new office at 5:17 p.m., with the sun still out, my bag light, my brain not buzzing with unfinished fires, and I realized I was humming under my breath like I used to as a kid before I learned to measure my worth in deadlines. On the train home, I scrolled past a LinkedIn post from my old company celebrating operational resilience with a glossy photo of leadership smiling in front of a whiteboard covered in buzzwords, and I felt a tiny sting that my fingerprints were all over the lessons they were now bragging about, but the sting didn't hook into me the way it used to. I thought about the day I'd been escorted out, the cardboard box, the glass-walled conference room, and how certain they'd been that I'd shrink, beg, prove I was a team player. I didn't. I learned slowly and awkwardly that being competent isn't the same as being cared for, and that the companies that call you a rock star often do it because they're planning to mine you until there's nothing left. When I got to my stop, my phone buzzed with a message from one of my mentees at the new job. "Hey, I used your boundary line in a meeting, and it worked. Thank you." I stared at that text for a long moment, throat tight, because that was the ripple I didn't expect, that my worst day had turned into someone else's shield. I walked the rest of the way home past corner stores and dog walkers and normal life, and it hit me that the most viral part of this story isn't the invoice or the leverage or the company scrambling. It's the quiet, unglamorous truth that I didn't win by outplaying them. I won by refusing to be owned by them ever again.